So like a lot of people, the holidays offer an opportunity for me to see people that I haven't talked to in quite a long time. A lot of old friends, a lot of old relatives. And you get to see how the modern events that we've all witnessed in the past 6 months have really had an impact on them. I'm used to, as a conservative, being affected by the terrorist attacks and the political upheavals of 2016. But I get the sense that my progressive friends and my progressive family members have been hurt all the more by this political season. And it's not just the election of Donald Trump, it's not just the Brexit vote, it's not any number of things that have happened that you'd ordinarily associate with the average SJW crying their head off because they think that Trump fascism is just around the corner in 2017. I think it goes deeper. 2016 wasn't just a political repudiation of the progressive movement. In many ways, talking to progressives, I get the sense that the Trump election is a better way to explain a more general uneasiness they've had with the political situation worldwide, both domestically and geopolitically. Something is changing in the world, and it goes far beyond the fact that Donald Trump was able to edge out Hillary Clinton in the Electoral College. No, I think for a lot of people in the traditionalist or conservative or libertarian communities, this is a perfect opportunity for schadenfreude. After all, haven't the progressives been in power for the last 8 years? Haven't they dominated all academic and media institutions? But if we do in fact stand on the verge of very dark times, schadenfreude's really short-lived. Progressives might one day be our ally, and it behooves us to understand them and understand the concerns they have. And so I went forward and made a special effort this Christmas season especially to try to talk to progressives, get an understanding of where their positions were. And as amicable as the discussions were, there were barriers. There were questions that I couldn't get across, and I felt questions that they were, to be quite honest, avoiding. Questions that I think really got to the heart of the incoherency of a lot of elements of the progressive movement in the modern age. I mean, I'll be perfectly frank, the progressive movement as it exists in the contemporary world seems like a deeply incoherent political movement, full of contradictions, with no real direction and no predictability in their values. They seem totally beholden to using language games to recast their positions and confuse people. The progressive views often seem a lot less like a coherent ideology and more just positions taken to demonstrate the moral superiority of the speaker in any given context. Hence the constant accusation by anti-progressives of virtue signaling. Now, I personally know a lot of very intelligent and very good-hearted progressives, so there is definitely more to the progressive ideology in the modern age than just affectation. But nonetheless, certain questions have to be answered to help other people skeptical of the progressive project understand what progressives are really looking for and really looking to achieve in the modern age. Because independent of a dialogue of some kind, it appears like the ideology has no internal consistency whatsoever. As such, when anti-progressives run up against the ideology in power, such as in universities or in media, it seems just to be an exercise of will and of special pleading for the most part. And I think 2017 is going to be a year where progressives really have to answer for their ideology, to really make people understand why they're doing things, and the justification for what they advocate, and what they use their institutional power to achieve. And once again, I think this comes back to answering a certain number of questions that are really quite open, that never have really been answered by modern intellectual progressives or modern progressive advocates in the context of pursuing their ends. I've asked these questions in many different contexts and I never get satisfactory answers, so I've decided to take a video to just list them off, to at least make explicit what I think needs to be answered by left-leaning movements in the coming year. So without further ado, here are 12 questions for progressives in 2017. Question 1. What does equality mean, and what would it take for a society to be equal? I'm starting this series of questions with really the most important question, the one that defines people's inability to understand what the progressive movement is really about. We all know that the central value that defines progressives and SJWs and other people on the left is equality. But what does that equality mean? I mean, at a certain level, all Americans or all people who believe in the liberal project are believers in equality, but usually this is limited to equality under the law. And progressives seem to be asking for much more than that. Moreover, there is sort of this absolute definition of equality, the sort of communism definition of equality, the sort of Harrison-Bergeron definition of equality, where everyone is essentially weighed down or locked into a Procrustean bed, where everything is absolutely made equal in every single aspect of human endeavor. But this last form of equality, at least 10 or 20 years ago, seemed to have been left behind by the modern progressive movement and the left in general. People realized, after the experience of communism typically, that such an equality or such a utopian dream was neither practical nor humane, nor even necessarily desirable in some philosophical sense. Progressives oftentimes dismiss accusations that the left wants to fit everybody into a Procrustean bed as hyperbolic misrepresentation of the left's position. But in the modern world, it's not really very clear how much this characterization of the left's ultimate goal is even incorrect. There are many people who seem to be advocating for just such a radical pursuit of equality. And if that's the goal, a utopia where the state seeks to equalize people, not just in their legal rights and privileges, but also in their economics and their pursuits and in their abilities, we are dealing with a radical force that really is not in alignment with many other ideologies. It's fundamentally irreconcilable to a great deal of religions and a great deal of other outlooks. In other words, it's almost impossible to negotiate with somebody who has such a radical vision for humanity's future. Now, I know what the progressives will oftentimes say. We're a diverse movement. There could be all sorts of definitions of equality. It varies from person to person. But even for radical movements, that's not necessarily true. For instance, I have a number of radical anarchist and libertarian friends, and when I ask them what liberty or freedom means, they all give me very consistent definitions. And as crazy as their future utopias are, as unrealistic as I think they are, they nonetheless have the coherency so that I can see from their ideology what the utopia would actually entail. This is just not present in progressive ideology, where it seems that nobody really understands what equality is, how they can pursue it, and what even the end goal is. This should be a big problem, because this type of incoherency will hamper not only progressives' ability to talk to people who are skeptical of their movement, but even to communicate a coherent vision of the future to people inside the progressive movement itself. So really, this is the first question that all progressives should really ask themselves. What is equality, and what would an equal society even look like? Question 2. What is racism? Who is racist? And how much should it really matter to us? Now, this is a very, very juicy question because so much of progressive politics in the last 10 years has essentially been insinuating that their opponents are racist. I know progressives say that they don't do this, but this is the reality for every person who has opposed them in the past. And any person who has really found themselves on the opposition of the progressive movement knows this. From traditionalist Catholics who want to have social justice, to the libertarian anarcho-capitalists who want everyone to be absolutely unrestricted in their actions. Racism is a common accusation brought by the left against its critics. Moreover, it's a hallmark of the left's criticism of contemporary society as a whole. But through all of this, they haven't answered the question of what racism actually is. Again, this was something that about 10 or 20 years ago would have been a very, very simple question to answer. Racism is just the discrimination of one person or a group of people based on their inalterable genotypical characteristics of race. We have an understanding of what race is, and discrimination based on that is racism. But thanks to the magic of incoherent academic disciplines, this definition no longer holds. Racism now has any number of definitions, from implicit bias to societal structures that marginally disadvantage people, to just the inequality between groups in and of itself. Moreover, things that would be classically considered racism, like outright discrimination against certain groups and actual harassment based on a certain group's status, can be considered not racist if those particular actions do not align with power that has already been historically collected in institutions. This is a complete contradiction to the standard definition of racism. Okay, so why should this matter? Words sometimes have multiple definitions. Why is this particularly a problem? Well, it's because of the place that racism, or the word racist, has in our society. In the late 60s, this word was deeply stigmatized, to the point where someone being identified as a racist in society will lose them their job, their property, any opportunity they have of interacting in society as any kind of upstanding person. This was done to unseat a large number of institutions that were explicitly racist and that were enacted prior to the civil rights movement. And it only really made sense under the original definition of the word racist, the explicit discrimination against some person or group based on racial characteristics. However, under the more loose definition, where the left is now claiming that virtually all people, or all people in a majority group, are racist against the minority, we now have a label that really applies to almost everybody. Under the previous definition of racism, the designation of someone as a racist justifies almost any action against them. And so, in toto, these two definitions really imply that any action taken against the left's political opponents is justified, since almost anyone is racist, and almost any action against a racist is justified because it is such a heinous status in society. Now, I know leftists can't mean this, but what do they actually mean by racism? Is it something that we really need to worry about, or is it something that's just an implicit bias of society that almost everyone really has, and is somewhat acceptable due to its ubiquity? Question 3. Can there be non-malicious inequality between social groups? Now, this question is really an extension off the last one, but I want to put a little bit of a finer point on it. So much of modern left racial criticism has focused around pointing out statistical inequalities between certain groups, whether they're in arrest rates, whether they're in economic status, or whether they're in educational achievement. And I think even people in the progressive movement will admit to this. This has been a hallmark of progressive politics in the last 10 or 20 years. But almost everyone who isn't in the progressive movement has realized that this has a very large caveat to it, which is that progressive groups largely do not care or do not point out group inequality that comes from certain groups that are largely allied with the progressive movement or that vote predominantly for progressive political parties. When we look at the statistical overachievement of, say, white men, the progressives are very clear that this difference is totally illegitimate and fundamentally malicious on the part of society. This is why the word white privilege has been such an ubiquitous term in left-wing political causes for the last 20 years. But as everybody, and here I really mean everybody who isn't a progressive or on the left wing or not interested in politics, has realized, this assertion of malicious inequality immediately ends as soon as we start talking about groups that are not considered on the outs by progressives, generally. Asians and Jewish people have a higher average wage and a higher average educational achievement. Women have a much lower conviction rate for the same crimes as men do. Gay men tend to earn more than straight men do. And girls outperform boys at all levels of academia. And yet, in each of these instances, if the inequality is brought to the attention of progressives, they will immediately assert that this is a benign inequality, that this is not attributable to some malicious aspect of society, and this just has to do with statistics of people making certain life decisions, or the fact that they worked harder to achieve the particular benefit they received in society. Now, maybe there are reasons for this. Maybe there is actual evidence that in the case of white people, this is always a malicious inequality. In the case of virtually everyone else, it's almost never a malicious inequality. But the case is never made. And in many ways, progressives feel no case needs to be made. This is just how things are. Now, setting aside for a moment that I think it's highly unlikely that all cases of white men being advantaged are malicious, while all cases of minorities or women being advantaged are perfectly benign, I don't think that the progressive movement can sweep this double standard under the rug anymore. It was one thing when Asians were a minuscule part of the American population, and it was one thing when the difference in the academic achievement between men and women was relatively small. But this is no longer the case, and everybody can see this except progressives. They need to answer the question: when can we determine that a group's statistical inequality is malicious, and when can we determine it's benign, and how do we make the assumptions going forward? Question 4. Can an institution, government or not, legitimately act to defend the interests or the continuity of a culture or race? Now, I call this the alt-right or the Richard Spencer question because this is the central question of all national self-determination, and this has been one of the biggest questions of 2016 that just has not been answered. This year kicked off with essentially a decision by the EU ruling elites, headed by Angela Merkel, that the nations of Europe had no right to preserve their own ethnic continuity or to preserve their own ethnic interests, to be perfectly blunt about it. There was a decision to really indefinitely let in migrants from the Middle East, with no case being made for advancing the general interest of the European peoples, and with every assumption that such a political action would disrupt the continuity of the European people's native culture. Now, of course, the fact that this happened isn't necessarily illegitimate and doesn't necessarily cast aspersions onto the progressive movement. What does open up this question and put quite a fine point on it was the assertion by many progressives that any objection to this particular political action was racist and illegitimate. But at this stage, everyone not actually ensconced in the left has been asking themselves the same question. When was this ever the case? Who decided this, and how is this applied? Because it doesn't seem to be applied universally. Very few countries believe this. Actually, almost no non-Western countries or non-European countries believe that there is a moral requirement to let in immigration that might be to the detriment of the native population. And even progressives are oftentimes caught advocating for this. They understand that there is a right to indigenous people's self-determination when it comes to cases like Israel, when it comes to cases like Tibet, when it comes to indigenous people's rights in any given modern country, when it comes to sovereignty rights in any given small country in Africa. They understand how the principle works, but it never gets to be applied universally. Moreover, when it comes to Western countries, there seems to be the insinuation that any attempt to preserve the cultural continuity of these countries is totally illegitimate, even if it's undertaken by a non-governmental organization. If there's coherency in this argument, I haven't seen it, because it seems to be purely special pleading. Question 5. Are some identities more legitimate than others? Now, this is going to be a very quick one, and it's closely related to the previous question, but the left does not act like all identities are equally legitimate. I remember going through progressive college and progressive high school educations. In those educational environments, there was no difficulty for teachers or peers to inform me that it really wasn't correct to identify as white, to identify as Christian, to identify as Western, to even identify as an American. All identities were artificial, all identities were constructed. They could be torn down just as easily. There is no sacredness to any of this association, and education existed as an act of questioning those implicit identities. That was, of course, until we get to things like sexuality, gender identity, and even race in certain contexts. When it comes to some groups, it's totally illegitimate to question the existence of that group or their identity. You can't question transgenders' status or their feelings of being associated with another sex. You can't question the identification with sexual orientation or even the identification of really strange sexual orientations like demi-queer. You can't even question other people's identification with race, which according to the left is totally socially constructed. And so you get ridiculous situations situations where academics that feel very comfortable lecturing people how they should deconstruct whiteness and destroy whiteness turn around and scream bloody murder the second somebody questions whether Rachel Dolezal and Sean King are actually truly black. I mean, are these identities purely fungible and contentless, or are they something sacred? This is something that has never really been decided on by the left, and it's important. Question 6. How serious is an act of non-consensual physical contact? Does it matter if the contact is sexual? Now, this is largely a transition from my previous set of questions and a little bit of a segue into the more sexual ones, but this is a very interesting question, one brought up by the philosopher Roger Scruton, and that is, if we know that an action has been taken between two people has been taken without consent, does it matter if it's sexual or not? If I were, for instance, to spit on somebody or to lightly push them to the extent that there is really no lasting physical damage, how big of a deal is that? If I were to compare that to something like an ambiguous date rape scenario where there is absolutely no physical harm and no circumstantial evidence of physical harm, we would regard those two circumstances very differently. One is a minor misdemeanor worth barely any consideration. The other is a heinous crime against the ages. Now, from a traditional Christian perspective, it seems that progressives have borrowed their aversion to coercive but not directly physical harmful sexual contact from the idea that sexuality is somehow spiritually sacred, and that coercion is a spiritual violation of that sacredness, something that would not necessarily be present in a secular worldview. It seems that our aversion to rape in this situation, in one where we no longer recognize sex as something unique, is fundamentally inaccurate. I think this is probably going to be the easiest of all the questions to answer because I can already anticipate the pushback. The natural pushback is to say that our aversion to rape is linked entirely to the psychological detriment, the trauma that people experience from a sexual contact that is non-consensual. And this is in fact the basis of our aversion to rape. But there are problems with this, and I think this is sort of illustrated by the next question. Question 7. Do people's emotions or cultural perceptions factor into what consent is, or how heinous the violation of consent is? Now, this is really the other shoe to question number 6, because the typical caveat from question 6 that we're going to essentially be appealing to emotional harm or emotional trauma immediately goes away when we try to incorporate the implicit relativism of a multicultural society, or of a society where we have massively different ideas of what's emotionally harmful. In short, in a multicultural society, we can't really get a very good idea about how bad a violation of consent is, considering that different cultures have different understandings of what is acceptable cultural behavior. In effect, you could be doing the same activities to two different people from two different cultures, and one might have an incredibly violent overreaction to it, a traumatic overreaction to it, while to another person it would be perfectly fine and almost expected. I know several people, in fact, that have suffered from literal PTSD because they had a consensual sexual interaction that went against their implicit morals. This isn't fake, they actually had an incredibly violent reaction that was very detrimental to their lives, but it was nonetheless born from a completely consensual interaction, even by the standards of affirmative consent. In effect, if you're trying to ground rape laws in some kind of emotional reaction, the multiculturalism precludes that. So, where do you come down? Is this a relevant feature when we're determining what is consent and how bad the violation of consent is? Where do you come down? Is this a relevant feature when we're determining what is consent and how bad the violation of consent is? Question 8. Can any moral distinction be made between consensual sex acts? Now, I think I have to give a hat tip to the blogger Millennial Woes on this one from the alt-right, who became infamous when he brought up the question of bestiality in a speech that probably should have been infamous for other reasons. But to make the point explicitly, if society goes along with the notion that not only is consent necessary for a sexual act to be considered good, but in fact sufficient for that act to be good, then where does that really leave us in confronting actions like bestiality or even virtual pedophilia? Now, there might be some confusion here. I'm not simply saying that progressives have to support the legality of these objectionable actions. The question I'm asking is, can any moral distinction be made? Can we even stigmatize bestiality, for instance? Can we even teach that it's wrong in the schools? Can parents discourage their children from bestiality or say that it's morally wrong in the same way that parents used to say that homosexuality is morally wrong? And if they can, why? I get the sense from progressives that not only do they believe that the state cannot make laws to prohibit consensual sexual actions undertaken by adults, but furthermore that no education or parental authority can discourage one individual from pursuing a consensual sexual act, or even condemn said sexual act in a pedagogical environment. If in fact that is the case, we have to confront this question head on. Can any sexual act be discouraged at all in a moral sense? And that includes things like bestiality and virtual pedophilia. Question 9. Is there a stopping point in the pursuit of equality? This is something that I've been thinking a lot about, and of course this relates directly to question number 1 that we started off. But where is the progressive movement taking its pursuit of equality? Will it only be legal? Will it only be economic? Will it only be cultural? Will it only be personal? I'm not so sure how far people actually understand equality to go, but at this point, progressives are asserting, in many different contexts, including academia, that any difference between groups of any different type is totally unacceptable at a statistical level. This has an enormous number of corollaries that people very rarely consider. I mean, as we all know, the progressives are very interested in reducing the inequality between, say, black families and white families. But another persistent inequality that exists is the difference in achievement between, say, intact families and broken families. This inequality is in fact more persistent than the first one, and has much more observable statistical consequences. If equality itself is the only thing wrong, then why is this latter instance of the difference between broken families and intact families not taken on? Is it just because of political inconvenience? Could we imagine a legal regime where children are punished because they come from intact families and therefore have intact family privilege? Maybe we'll allow this type of equality to become part of the mainstream progressive movement, but in that case, why stop there? Why do smart children have more of an advantage over people who are mentally impaired? And equality can keep on going, but where does it end? Question 10. What means are legitimate in the pursuit of equality? Now, at this point, I've illustrated any number of core disagreements that can be faced by progressives and really anybody from a more mainstream perspective. And I think going forward, given the place we are right now, these differences are only going to become more pronounced. And at some level, progressives are going to find themselves on the outs with the mainstream culture. And I have to ask, what means do progressives think are legitimate to bring the mainstream culture over to their side? They have the power of academia, they have the power of media, and so far they've shown no desire to actually restrain their application of these powers. This has really become a very pertinent question for me subsequent to the victory that the progressive movement achieved on gay marriage. After that, it became very apparent that the progressives were in a mode where they were seeking to literally punish their ideological opponents. Even in my home state, there is a high-profile instance of an attorney general seeking an egregious fine from one woman who refused to do an arrangement for a gay wedding. There is no evidence of discrimination against gay people. This was simply a desire not to participate in a ceremony. Yet, the particular government in question saw it fit to fine her an amount that would cost her not only her business, but also her home. This, compounded with the instance of Brendan Eich essentially being fired for opposing gay marriage, leads one to believe that there's really no powers that progressives feel restrained from using when it comes to punishing their opponents in the culture war. And if we don't have a good idea of what equality means, or where the pursuit of equality will end, I'm not so sure really who isn't an opponent of the progressive movement in the culture war ultimately. Question 11. Is ideological bias a problem in publicly funded spaces? Now, I'm sure progressives understand that they dominate universities in a way that I can't really think of any ideology dominating a sphere of higher education since universities ceased being simply Christian seminaries with a philosophy department attached. But this opens a huge question. Universities and institutions of education are funded out of public coffers. That means I'm paying for someone else's ideology to essentially be spread. Now, the classic explanation of this was that universities were an open marketplace of ideas, and progressive ideas just happened to be the ones that had won. Now, this may have been plausible in the 90s, but nobody is believing it now, and nothing could put a finer point on it than the protests, heckling, and prohibition of conservative speakers on modern university campuses. Numerous conservative speakers have been forced to be disinvited by progressive activists, who have roamed essentially unopposed by the administration and the faculty on campus. Moreover, the activist groups that essentially dominate the student body have succeeded in getting prominent conservative speakers, like Ben Shapiro, from appearing on campus because the security of the event could not be guaranteed. And again, there's been no pushback by the administration whatsoever. The silence of progressive thinkers on this point and on this problem has been deafening. They've made almost no sound on it and have essentially allowed the status quo to persist. But under this status quo, we are talking about a publicly funded institution that is essentially a facet of the progressive movement. This means in essence that there is no marketplace of ideas. This is simply a progressive seminary writ large, and I'm paying for it. Question 12. Why should we tolerate progressive cultural hegemony in public spaces? Now, in the last question, I alluded to progressive cultural dominance in universities, but this also extends to the dominance of media, to essential and fundamental dominance of large companies, including social media companies that hold an effective monopoly on public discourse. This journalistic, academic, and corporate class of progressives holds an absolute veto power over conservative opinions functionally in a modern-day society. They can ban Twitter accounts, they can shut down YouTube accounts they disagree with, and they can otherwise restrict how public dialogue occurs in the modern-day world. Oh, and I know the pushback. This power is almost never used, and when we use it, it's only against really objectionable people, like Ben Shapiro for some reason, and Milo Yiannopoulos, who we've decided are terrible. But this answer doesn't matter worth a hill of beans for anybody who has opposed the progressive movement for long. And at the end of this line of questioning, it should be incredibly obvious why. The reason why this assurance makes no sense to anybody who opposes the progressive movement is there's no assurance about where the progressive movement is going to stop. What's racist one day is not what's racist the next. And if they call Ben Shapiro racist, sexist, homophobe, tomorrow they'll be calling you racist, sexist, homophobe, David Brooks, Ross Douthat, or anyone else who happens to be on the opposite side of a major culture war issue, or a major progressive economic issue, for that matter. If you're somebody who is skeptical of the progressive movement and frequently finds himself not on the left, the opposition to the progressives in the media spheres, in the academic spheres, and in the corporate spheres have to be priority number one, because the censorship of the really extreme right today will naturally be the censorship of yourself tomorrow. The only thing the progressive movement can guarantee is a constant salami slice where their enemies are fed into the memory hole one by one by one, and nobody can mount an effective resistance. Now, I started this YouTube channel in part to oppose people on the alt-right, people like Richard Spencer. But when Richard Spencer's Twitter account was unceremoniously deactivated for whatever reason Twitter came up with, I had to take Richard Spencer's side, because the option otherwise was to cooperate with a censorship effort which would inevitably be targeted at me and my own causes. Survival tends to make weird bedfellows. And that's really all that can be said. If the progressive movement isn't going to qualify what it means by equality, what what it considers acceptable, what it considers moral, and the extent of its ambitions, how can anybody on a conservative coalition ever hope to come to some kind of agreement with them, where Richard Spencer is more of an enemy than the progressive movement that threatens their own ideology with censorship? It's very hard to see how this will occur. And with that, I think I'm drawing down these 12 questions that progressives need to answer for 2017. I want these questions to be as honest as possible, and I hope I didn't color them too much with my clarifications. But I wanted to really elucidate where the big disagreements were, what made the progressive position so unpalatable to modern skeptics and modern traditionalists. I don't know if some reconciliation is possible, but it has to start with these questions, or some questions that are very much like them. At any rate, I hope that any progressives in my audience will answer these questions in the comments, send me an email, contact me on Skype. Hey, if you even want to come on my channel and discuss them, I'd be more than happy to. But I know from personal experience, especially from my whole YouTube video concerning slavery reparations, that these offers are very rarely actually taken up, even though there are more than enough progressive hecklers in the comments section. So I'll be trying to do a part 2 where I try to piece together an understanding of how a progressive would answer these questions, based on my personal interactions and the comments I get, either via email or in the comments section. At any rate, I hope you found these questions somewhat useful, and maybe they'll actually facilitate some good conversations in 2017. Have a great night.